Welcome. I hope you are having a wonderful night, dear viewer. Tonight, I will be telling some terrifyingly scary stories. Make sure to leave your feedback on the comments so I can make this the best experience for you. And if you have any stories you would like me to tell, you can send them through the link in the description. Let's begin. Story 1. When I was around 16 years old, I had an unsettling experience while babysitting for a family friend. The evening was turning dark, approximately 8 or 8:30, as I took the young girl named Maddie outside to play on the swing set in their backyard. However, something began to stir within me, an eerie sensation that we were being observed. I scanned the surroundings, but there was no one in sight. Nonetheless, an inexplicable sense of unease persisted, prompting me to bring Maddie indoors since it was nearing her bedtime anyway. After putting her to sleep at around 9 o'clock, I settled in the living room to watch some TV. However, my tranquility was abruptly shattered when, about 10 minutes later, I caught the sound of rustling coming from outside the house. Perhaps foolishly, I decided to investigate, hoping to put my fears to rest. I stepped out but found nothing unusual, convincing myself that it must have been some small creature scurrying about. With that thought in mind, I returned indoors, dismissing the incident. Around 20 minutes later, as I sat in the living room, an unsettling noise reached my ears once more. Footsteps emanating from Maddie's room upstairs. Concerned, I made my way upstairs to check on her and ensure everything was all right. Upon opening the door to her room, my eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness, but the faint illumination from the window provided some visibility. And then, in the corner, I spotted a shadowy figure, crouched and motionless. A surge of adrenaline coursed through me, and without hesitation, I swiftly turned on the light, revealing a man standing before me, in a panicked attempt to escape. He dashed towards the door, but instinct took over, and I delivered a swift kick to his most vulnerable area. Moments later, as I contacted the authorities, it came to light that this man had been clandestinely residing in the family's basement. For approximately 6 months, he had been stealthily entering and leaving the premises through a hole in the side of the house, observing the family both during their outdoor activities and while they slept. Since that harrowing incident, I have refrained from taking on any further babysitting responsibilities. The ordeal left an indelible mark on my psyche, serving as a constant reminder of the dangers that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary circumstances. Story 2. Every night, my dad was in charge of putting me to bed. He would help me brush my teeth, and then would tuck me into my nice, warm bed. Then he would tell me a story. Every night, it was the same story. The story of Bosco and Billy. I had lots of books in my room, as my mother would read to me throughout the day, but Dad would never read any of those books. He would always tell me the same story. I always assumed that either the story had come from a book, but my father had told it so many times that he didn't need to read from the book anymore, or that it was a story he was told as a child. I always enjoyed the story of Bosco and Billy. I always found that it would help me go to sleep. Usually, I would be almost asleep by the end of the story. I slowly learned all of the words to the story, and would sometimes recite it along with my dad. For some reason, probably because I heard it every night for years, the story stuck with me, and even to this day, I still remember all of the words to the story. The story, in its entirety, is as follows. Billy the bear was an ordinary bear, with an ordinary life, but he had a small friend named Bosco who got him into strife. Most of the time, Bosco would behave, but sometimes he acted out. Billy tried to keep him in line, but sometimes he would break out. Like one time, Bosco was hungry and decided he would steal food. Billy tried to stop him and explain to Bosco that stealing is rude, but Bosco didn't listen. He stole the food anyway, and took it to a secret spot and hid it away. Bosco took the food to the large oak tree that was in the woods. There, he stuffed the food inside, and that's where he hid his goods. Billy never found the stolen food. It's still hidden there to this day. Bosco wishes that it is never found, he hopes, and he prays. Billy is kind, and Bosco is a little bit silly. And that is the story of Bosco and Billy. Now, the story seems innocent enough, and I always thought it was a cute little story about two bears. But after recent events, I now know it is a lot more sinister than it first appears. My dad passed away a few years ago, and it took a toll on all of us, my mom especially. She began a little bit reclusive after my father passed, and so I didn't see her as often because she shut herself off from others. I spent a long time trying to create a relationship with my mother again, and slowly, over the course of a couple of years, I did manage to reconnect with her. Things weren't as they once were, but she did invite me over once a week for a cup of coffee. During these hour-long visits, we would sit in the kitchen and talk about times gone by, about my childhood, about my time at school, and about all of the good times we had together. The one subject that didn't come up, however, was my father. I think the pain was still too raw for my mom to talk about him. On one of my weekly visits, though, I thought that I would try and mention my father, as I felt that it might do Mom some good to talk about him. I decided to mention the story that he would tell me every night. Do you remember that story Dad used to tell me before bed? The story of Billy and Bosco. I hesitantly asked, not knowing how Mom would react to the mention of her late husband. Mom looked up from her cup of coffee that she was drinking. She looked confused. Maybe because it was the first time he had been mentioned for a number of years. Or maybe because she didn't know what I was talking about. No, I don't remember that story, she replied. You had a lot of books, so I can't remember all of them. I was a bit surprised by this. Dad told it to me every night, so I would have thought that she would remember it. I then went on to explain that it wasn't a book. It was a story that would recite without reading it off of a page, because he knew it so well. I thought that your father would read you a different book each night, she said, sounding confused. That's what he always told me anyway. I thought that this was especially strange, because he never read me one of my books, and I would have thought that my own mother would have known this. What was this story about, she asked me. It was about two bears, one named Billy and one named Bosco. I was about to continue explain the story when my mom suddenly interrupted me. Did you just say the bear was named Bosco? She asked me, sounding quite serious. Yeah, that's right. His name was Bosco, I replied. That's strange, Mom said. She had a look on her face that looked like she was trying to remember something. Your father used to tell me about a friend that he used to have named Bosco. Mom continued. He used to say that Bosco would get him in a lot of trouble when he was younger. I never met this Bosco, which your dad said was a good thing. He also said that he only met up with Bosco only once or twice after we met, and then your father told me that he was no longer going to see Bosco. He said that he finally got rid of him. I was always curious as to who he was. I have never seen any photos of him, or any evidence that he existed, now that I think about it. So it is strange that he told you a story that contained a character with the name Bosco. Mom stopped talking for a second, and I didn't know how to respond. She then looked at me and asked, Do you remember this story? Can you tell it to me? I recited the entire story to her. She listened to the whole tale without changing her expression. She took it all in, and then she asked an oak tree, Are you sure that Bosco hid the food in an old oak tree in the woods? Yeah, it was definitely an old oak tree. Why is that? I asked her, sensing that something wasn't quite right. It's just that on mine and your father's first date, he took me to an old oak tree that was inside the Shelton Woods, only a 10-minute drive from here, she responded. He told me then that it was lucky for me that Bosco hadn't decided to interrupt their date. She then stopped talking and stared at the wall behind where I was sitting. I think it is time for you to go now. I'm sorry, she told me, a hint of sadness in her voice. I thought that maybe it was for the best that I did leave. I got up and gave her a small hug, which she didn't even seem to notice. Then I collected my things and headed out the front door. I got into my car and begun to drive home. On the way home, however, the thought of the old oak tree in Bosco began to fill my head. I couldn't escape these thoughts. I didn't know what it all meant, if it meant anything at all. I don't know what compelled me, but I had to visit the Shelton woods and find this oak tree. I turned my car around and headed in the direction of the woods. 15 minutes later, I found myself standing at the edge of the woods. I took a step forward and entered them. I didn't know exactly where this oak tree was, but I was determined to find it. I explored the woods for around 10 minutes before I saw it. Standing in front of me was a huge oak tree, its branches extending high up into the sky. I walked over to the base of the tree. A sense of fear started to overcome me. Something didn't feel right. It felt like something terrible had happened here. I looked down at the ground, at the base of the tree, and I saw that the dirt there looked slightly different than the rest of the dirt in the woods. I don't know why I did this, but I bent down and begun to dig in this dirt. The police say that if I hadn't started digging, then they probably never would have found them. There were 4 bodies in total, all young women around the age of 24. All of them had been dead for over 30 years. It was undeniable. They were all murdered and buried under this tree. The DNA testing was also clear. My father was responsible for the killings. Somehow, he managed to keep all of this hidden for many years. He never told anyone. The only clues that he gave were through my bedtime story, which I think was his way of confessing. The only thing I am not sure of now is, who is Bosco? Maybe my father and Bosco are the same person, or maybe he really did have a friend with that name. I don't think we will ever know. I don't think I want to know. Story 3. Dad packed his Hunter starter pack, 2 Snickers bars, a gallon of water, a half-gallon of milk, 2 protein bars, and a handful of Slim Jims. He was dressed in camouflage with his yellow sunglasses, the ones he bought off the TV. I didn't have the kind of gear he did, so I settled on hand-me-downs from Pat. A camo t-shirt, hiking boots, and tan khakis. In a moment of muscle memory, I texted him to make sure it was okay to wear his stuff. It took me halfway through the message to remember he wasn't going to respond. I put my phone in my pocket and followed Dad out the door. We got in his pickup truck and drove toward our destination. I didn't know where the hunting grounds were, but Dad said they weren't far. Outside, the sun was crawling into the sky, turning the black into shades of purple and red. I didn't know why we had to leave so early. Dad never explained it, and I never asked. We just need to get one thing clear today. Dad chewed on tobacco as he talked. What is it? I asked. When we have the shot, we can't hesitate, he said. Yeah, sure, I said. Dad took Pat hunting every year, and all I heard was how good of a shot Pat was. Personally, I preferred video games and horror movies to sitting in the mud and killing woodland creatures. Mom and I would prepare the post-hunting feast of rye BS and baked potatoes, which at least earned me some brownie points from Dad. When we hit the highway, Dad took the exit south toward Pittsburgh, which I thought was odd. I didn't know much about hunting, but I knew there were a lot more deer in the Allegheny Mountains than there were by the stadiums. Do we need to get supplies or something? I asked. Dad picked up an old Sheetz cup and spit into it. Nope. We ended up in Squirrel Hill just northeast of downtown, which had big colonial houses and a boutique movie theater. Mom took me there once to see Booksmart because it wasn't playing at the Cineplex in our town. We ate Bunch of Crunch and popcorn, our shoulders bumping as we laughed. Dad never went to neighborhoods like this, though. He hated yuppies. After a few more minutes of driving, we pulled into a hiking trail parking lot. Ahead of us, I could see a neighborhood through the trees. The trail ran along their backyards. We were the only car in the lot. Dad didn't say anything as he went to the bed and grabbed his rifle. I stayed in the truck, waiting for my orders. When it was time to hunt, Dad knocked on my window. I opened the door and followed him onto the trail. I bet you like how quiet the house has gotten, Dad said. I was walking behind him. Carefully dodging the sticks, he snapped with his boots. Do I like that the house is quiet? You're an indoor kid, he said. And the house was loud with everyone in it. I loved your mom, but she had opinions almost as big as mine. Pat and I mostly agreed, but he was starting to get a mind of his own. Dad laughed as he spit more tobacco into the mud. Ahead of us, the neighborhood was getting closer. "I don't like the quiet," I said. Dad nodded as he slipped a bullet into the rifle. I was surprised how close the neighborhood was to the hunting grounds. When I imagined hunting, I pictured dudes in tree houses on the side of a mountain. No people in sight. Wouldn't people here be scared by the gunshot? "I like quiet when I choose the quiet," Dad said. "We didn't choose our quiet, did we?" I didn't say anything. Instead, I chewed on the inside of my cheek. After a few bites, I could taste blood. "I have to live in a quiet house because of another man's decision." Dad went on. "Do you know how many times I was drunk in a bar and had the thought of just driving home? I'm not a rich man. I couldn't afford a $20 cab every time I want to buzz. But I called one every time. I knew there were moms and kids out on those roads, and I didn't want their blood on my hands." Dad stopped walking. "Is that 411? He asked, pointing to a house. I studied it. In the distance, I could see the mailbox. 411 was written in block letters on the side. "I think so," I said. The house was straight out of a James Bond movie. Massive windows, a back deck that wrapped around the first floor, Greek statues. There was a pool and a waterfall in the backyard. Although it was still early in the morning, there was a kid and a mom out by the water. The boy, probably about preschool age, had a remote in his hand. There was a small boat circling in the water. Dad took a knee and lifted the scope out of his bag. "Have you learned about STDs?" Dad was whispering now. He looked through the scope and adjusted it. It took him 3 times to get it right. His hand was shaking. "STDs?" I asked. "Diseases with crazy names getting passed from person to person," Dad said. "You have a fun night with a girl and wake up with a fist-sized lip. You know about those, right?" I nodded. I looked back at the woman and kid. She was kneeling down next to him, rubbing his shoulder. She had this big smile on her face. Like this kid operating this boat was the greatest thing to ever exist. She reminded me of Mom. "You know about that?" Dad asked. He was laying on his belly in the mud now. The rifle was pointed to the house with the waterfall pool. "Know about what?" "How diseases can transmit between people." He was getting frustrated. "Sure. Yeah, why?" "Pain is like an STD, he said. People give it to each other. If you have a lot of pain in your life, you need to be responsible. Transferring pain to someone is never innocent. Sweat broke out on my forehead. I didn't like the way Dad was talking. It was the same way he talked when he got the news about Mom and Pat. "Where are the hunting grounds?" I asked. Dad cocked his rifle. "The man who owns that house gave us a lot of pain," he said. I looked back through the trees. The pieces were coming together. "No, Dad," I said. "We need to go home. Did you know that he left the hospital after 2 hours?" "What?" "Mom and Pat are sitting dead in a car, and he's skipping home to his family," Dad said. He only had a couple of bruises. Dad pressed his eye against the scope. "We need to redistribute our pain," he said. I never went against my dad. He and I didn't have the best relationship, but there was a silent understanding between us. Stay out of my way, and I'll stay out of yours. But there was nothing to be understood here. Dad took a long, slow breath. As he exhaled, I dropped down and shoved the rifle's barrel into the dirt. "Hey," he barked, pushing me back. "Let's go home," I said. "We don't have a home," he said. Dad turned on his side and kicked me. His foot landed hard into my stomach, sending me back into the mud. "Please don't do this," I said. I tried moving closer again, but it hurt too much. When I breathed, I could feel the sharp edge of my rib puncturing something. I took short, wispy inhales like a wounded animal. Dad didn't look at me. He kept his focus on the woman and child. "This is for you, baby doll," he whispered. The sound of his rifle echoed through the forest. I closed my eyes and buried my face in the mud. As the ripples of the blast softened, I heard a splash. I lifted my head out of the grass blade by blade. The remote-controlled boat was still doing circles. The woman was looking into the pool, her eyes as wide as dinner plates. She stood quiet for a moment. When she finally screamed, her eyes didn't change. The only thing that moved was her mouth. It dropped open like a nutcracker's. The sound she made was raw and cavernous. As the boat slowed to a stop, the water under it turned purple, then brown, then red. Dad took his face away from the scope and cried. It wasn't the way he cried at Mom and Pat's funeral. Those were back. Straight, tough guy cries. These were different. He wept like a kid who didn't get the right toy for Christmas. Then, as if hypnotized, Dad stood up, wiped the dirt off his overalls, then walked back toward the car. I watched him walk down the path. His posture caved in. I wanted to run up and grab him, tackle him, punch in those stupid eyes. But I couldn't. When I tried to move, my body didn't respond. The woman's cries echoed closer to me, as if I was the god she was begging to. I wanted to vomit. I didn't know if Dad's pain went away, but mine began to grow.